I will argue we've had an ordering principle since we created DoD, Defense Department, back in 1947. And that ordering principle, I'll describe it as great power war. We assume we're going to fight somebody very big, high level of technology just like ours. It's going to be an all-out declared war. It's an industrial era mobilization model, which I don't think any more fits the circumstances we face. So I will argue for a larger definition, and I will call that definition system perturbations. You will say we have new definitions of warfare. It's called a revolution in military affairs. It's called fourth generation warfare. It's called net-centric warfare. I will tell you those are all definitions of war within the context of war. When we have to think about war within the context of everything else, like who pays for the war, who shows up for the peace. How did we get to this point? Three-tiered perspective. I'm going to talk about the system as the whole, nation states, individuals living within nation states. In the Cold War, we had a system-level definition of conflict and threat. It was called Great Power War, World War III between us and the Soviets. Because we could never fight them in that kind of war, too dangerous. On the level of nation states, we only engaged in proxy wars. Our side fought their side, and their side fought our side. Sometimes we'd get bored and we'd switch sides, like with Ethiopia and Somalia. You take them for a while. Down here, we had the so-called lesser includeds, which we preferred to leave to law enforcement. This is what we organized around. Even though 95% of our business was this, we sub-optimized for that because that was the whole enchilada. Since we got through the Cold War without global nuclear Armageddon, I'll say, good choice. We get to the 1990s. The Soviets don't come along. We downshift. We say, two major theater wars is almost like a great power war. Do you think we could sell Congress on that? And we did. It was called Les Aspin's Bottom-Up Review. I know, because when I brief Congress, they say, yeah, that's it. That's what you sold us. Down here, everybody got a promotion. I'm not just a terrorist. I'm a transnational actor. Up here, we didn't have anything, so we made something up. A threat to be determined. China, all grown up. But this is what we sold Congress. This is what we organized around, an abstract force-sizing principle. We come to today. What should we organize around? Some people say, for $450 billion, you better do better than just whacking the Taliban 6 weeks later. How about protecting Americans? How about taking $200 billion out of defense and putting it in the Department of Homeland Security now? What the military fears about that kind of argument is that they will be dragged down into the muck. They will be ruined as a military. You'll ruin this military that we spent 25 years putting together since the end of Vietnam. You'll destroy it. You'll turn us into a giant police force. What we face is a problem of success, not failure. This is the deeper reach of U.S. military power over time. I got into this business 15 years ago to do strategic nuclear planning against the Soviets. It was a war against a bloc. By the middle of my career, I was working on regional hegemons, wars against bad regimes. Now we fight warfare against individuals. We went into Panama, we wanted Noriega. We went into Somalia, we figured out I was ID'd in his clan. We went into the Balkans, we figured out just get Milosevic and his people. We went into Iraq looking for a deck of cards. We're just here for the bad guys. Please go about your business. We don't fight militaries anymore. We don't fight nation states. And to call it interstate war when the U.S. comes in as a leader of a coalition to take down a few bad actors is such an abuse of the phrase. When I got into this business, the standard was an 8 to 9 minute response to Soviet nuclear launching of attack. Within a couple of years, our standard is going to be a UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, operating on the far side of the earth. It's going to find, recognize, and kill one person in 8 to 9 minutes. That is an amazing evolution in my 15-year career. How much will our military forces change to mirror this environment? I'll tell you, our legacy, in terms of capability spread, looks something like this. We're primarily built to fight other nation states, so the bulk of our capabilities are found there. We have a certain strategic capacity and the ability to go inside nation states and deal with individuals, civil affairs, special ops. I will tell you, the Revolution in Military Affairs crowd and this administration, when they came in, this OSD, this Office of Secretary of Defense, Their dream of transformation was a very pristine military that was going to be largely a system-level function, a certain capacity to defeat nation states. Never were going to do any of this stuff. Never go inside nation states, never nation build, none of that stuff. Condi Rice, National Security Advisor, said no special operations personnel are ever going to escort kids to kindergarten on my watch. Words she has subsequently had to eat, because the global war on terrorism adds back this part big time. You're going to deal with global terrorism. You're going to get inside nations. Otherwise, you field a first-half team in a league that insists on keeping score until the end of the game. So we can run up the score by halftime and then get our asses kicked the rest of the time, unless we rethink the scene between war and peace. This force gets you the Iraq War. Brilliant. This force gets you the trouble we have now. This force. That was Rumsfeld's argument. Great argument. That was Shinseki's argument, Chief of Army Staff. Great argument. Problem is, we called both definitions how to fight this war. And the answer was they were two definitions for two different things. One was to fight the war, and one was to wage the peace. And until we separate those concepts, we're not going to understand that we're basically going to move from this diamond shape to this hourglass, and it's going to be hard. We have to understand that we're going to fight different people across these spaces. Until we create a force for these back half situations, we are not going to score any real victories in this global war on terrorism. What we really need, and what this reflects, is the lack of an A to Z system for dealing with politically bankrupt states. What do I mean by that? An A to Z system, meaning you take a country into A, they come out on Z. What's a good example? The International Monetary Fund has a system, A to Z, for dealing with an economically bankrupt state. It's basically a sovereign Chapter 11. You go in at A, you come out at Z. We argue about this rule set incessantly. But it's basically there. What we have for dealing with politically bankrupt states. Think about front half, think about back half. We have the UN Security Council as a grand jury. I indict you, I indict you. I can't do anything about it, but I indict you. We have a Leviathan called the US military, which says in effect, you want me to take them down? I'll take them down. And on the far end, we have an international criminal court to try these guys. What we are missing is an executive function to take that indictment and do something with it. I think that's going to be found in a G7, G8, G20 over time, not in the UN Security Council. What we are missing is the US-enabled Sys Admin force, as I like to call it. The back half force that attracts coalition partners, because we make clear we're going to wage peace as effectively as we wage war. And what we're missing is what Sebastian Mallaby describes as an international reconstruction fund, an IRF, like an IMF, to deal with the rehabilitation, reconstruction of any regime you decapitate. I will argue, though, if the US military doesn't create this system can't come into being. Because until we create this, we won't get the coalition partners. When I give this brief abroad to foreign militaries, they tend to jump at the Sys Admin concept as opposed to the Leviathan concept, because they say, you know what, we can't even play with you in big war. We can't keep up. We can barely talk to you, but we can do the back half stuff. And a lot of GAP countries prefer to do this. Why? They get paid $1,100 per soldier per month by the UN. It's a moneymaker. But if we don't create this capability, this system cannot come into being. You'll say, you're asking too much of DOD. I say you created the internet and you changed the world. I'll say you created GPS and you changed the world. You created UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, and you have changed the world and are continuing to change the world. You create this force. You seed it. You prioritize it. You show me a 4-star military police officer, you'll change the world. What do I mean by the exporting to security? Pretty simple stuff for this audience. You train their military leaders here. You exhibit presence. You cooperate with their militaries. You respond to crises. You do joint exercises. You pre-position equipment over there. You have permanent bases, alliances. Sometimes you go all the way to an occupation. My point is, you don't measure it in terms of bombs dropped. You measure it in terms of the attention we pay regions. So think about those 4 flows. Core gap, what has to happen? Essentially, people got to go from the gap to the core in large numbers. Security's got to go from the old core, specifically in the first instance, to the Middle East, increasingly throughout the gap. But first, focused on the Middle East because a lot of energy's got to come out of here over the next 25 years before we move on to hydrogen. And the long-term investments have to continue to integrate this half the world's population over here. That is the baby we cannot throw out with the bathwater in this global war on terrorism. So I am concerned very much when we don't have Indians and Chinese and Russians as part of the occupation force in Iraq. It's a real problem. It's a strategic error. Start wrapping it up. We master this new definition of crisis and instability so we understand how to wage war within the context of everything else. We screw up any one of these flows, we could screw up the system. We have destroyed globalization before, and we can definitely do it again. We have to understand that when we wage war, we administer to a system. I see it as a 3-pronged strategy. 1, strengthen the core's ability to withstand system perturbations like 9/11. 2, firewall the core off from the gap's worst exports. 3, you got to shrink the gap. Only a small portion of it involves military actions. The vast bulk of it is foreign direct investment. The vast bulk. Here's the stuff that gets the most play now in the book, which frankly I wasn't going to put into the book because I thought it was a little too far out there. But events in Iraq make it a lot more relevant. Make an argument, again, another stretching one. Difference between defense and security. Historically, defense means take care of the homeland. And as Art Stabrowski likes to say, security means everything else. I could do this for $100 billion. We spend $350 billion over here. Historically, we had 2 different forces to do that. It's written in the Constitution. Raise an army, maintain a navy. Your big stick force, your baton stick force with the Marines. Your can of whoop ass, how you keep the system functioning. We decided in 1947 to put those 2 together. Why? Because we believed, correctly, we were going to be involved in a long-term hair-trigger standoff with the Soviets. And so we merged the definition of America's national defense and the whole world going up in flames. Won't argue with that definition. Problem is, that definition no longer holds. What has happened since the end of the Cold War? What has happened is basically that bifurcation I described earlier. Operating one military, buying another. Gets harder over time. It'll get very hard over the next year in Iraq. Very hard. We've been having these arguments ever since the end of the Cold War. Let's go back to what we had before. As somebody at the Naval War College, we like the idea. Some people think 9/11 really triggered the bifurcation. Home game, Homeland Security. Away game, Department of Defense. I believe the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was a strategic error. I don't think it's going to increase coordination whatsoever. I think we're going to waste a lot of money. We're going to feel good about it. But any notion of putting up walls between us and the outside world is a waste of time. The shock of 9/11 should have pushed us into embracing the world, not pulling back from the world. I knew when we went into Iraq, we would defeat the Iraq army with ease, and that we'd probably screw up the occupation badly. Why? Because we don't have a back half force. And because we don't have a back half force, we don't get those 17,000 peacekeepers from India, which basically says, you know what? I don't think you got it. I think the occupation of Iraq is transforming transformation. And I think it's about time we admit that we have, living uncomfortably inside the Department of Defense, both a Department of War and a Department of everything else. I think Don Rumsfeld is an amazing Secretary of War. I don't think we have a Secretary for everything else. And that's how you get Abu Ghraib. That's how you get all the screw-ups in Iraq. We don't have a Secretary for everything else. 2 missions fundamentally at odds. We need a Leviathan force for that Hobbesian world called the Gap. That force is going to win you wars. We also need a peace waging force. The back half force. What's amazing is, when our forces get to do this stuff, they come back with very high re-enlistment rates. They feel very good about Sys Admin work. So don't tell me we can't find the people for that right-hand force, because I know we can. But you can't take them under the circumstances of this, especially the reserve component, then send them over for extended duties, and oh, by the way, you might have to slip back into this. Because we didn't shut down the war very effectively. Other differences. The Leviathan force has traditional partners who all look suspiciously like the United Kingdom and their former colonies, which is without surprise. They're multinational states, like in India, like a Canada, Australia, United States. These partners, much different, much wider array. This is your jointness. This is so much more. Interagency. I call this your dad's military. I call this your mom's military. Your dad's military, Leviathan force, I want them young, male, unmarried, slightly pissed off. They like Nintendo? I say, great. I got a 9-year-old they can have right now. This is going to be older, married with children, more educated, gender balanced. This one is not coming under the purview of the International Criminal Court. This one is. This one will not move in the direction of civilian law, but remain very distinct from society and military law. This one will move in the direction of civilian law, become more like cops. This one will respect the restrictions, posse comitatus, military forces operating inside the United States. This force is going to obliterate those distinctions over time. These are the ground troops for your Northern Command. Leviathan force will not hold press conferences. Sys Admin force will be open source. Different definitions of network. And then the command arrangements. This is how you make sense of Dana Priest's work. Washington Post. They're your proconsuls. They've been doing Sys Admin around the world for years. All we have to do is admit it. They're combatant commanders, the biggest foreign policy budgets in the US government, dwarfing that estate. And then look at what the Vice Chairman, Peter Pace, is doing in terms of long-term war planning. You're going to see that war-fighting force drawn back into these previously supporting commands. You're going to see that force commanded increasingly by a Joint Forces Command. And that's going to be the big stick we break out every so often. Whereas this is the force that's never coming home. Now the best slide. Who gets the kids? This is the part in the brief where the Marines go, Gah! This makes perfect sense historically. Small arms, small wars. This is what these guys have been doing throughout their history. This is why this is not going to be a toothless force. The Marines are like my West Highland Terrier. They get up every morning, they want to dig a hole, and they want to kill something. So it's not going to be a toothless force. Absolutely not. And it returns to their historical roots. Now let's talk the Navy. Submarines, strategic, go over here to the Leviathan force. Surface combatants, Sys Admin force. We move progressively toward what I call the smart dust Navy, based on our experience at tracking things with Soviet subs. We need to get global on that basis. Carriers go in both directions. Why? Because I work for the Naval War College. I'd like to have my contract picked up. Now, they go in both directions because they're just so darn good. Same thing with airborne, same principle. Your big armor goes towards the Leviathan. Your ground troops, by and large, go to Sys Admin. So I believe in the transformed force that largely wins from the air and decimates the opponent. But you got to have lots of boots on the ground for the Sys Admin work, for the peace waging. And then the Air Force. Your logistics, both directions, just like carriers and airborne. You see the similarities. But your fighters and your bombers, they're the Leviathan force. And then special ops, distinct from Marine Corps. They are really your assassination squad, they're your leave behind force, they're your first in, last out. That's how it breaks down. Last slide. Definition of transformation. Art Zabrowski likes to say it's a three-headed monster. Inside the Pentagon, it's mostly about buying stuff. That's what the Hill cares about. To hell with your vision, do you build it in my district? Inside the E-ring, it's all about running the Defense Department better. The revolution in business affairs. This is the one that's really changing. The role of the Defense Department in national security. Best question I ever got in response to this brief came from Esquire staff. In your vision of the future, what changes more? These are the answers we came up with. We think the rest of the world is going to change more than the United States. It's not about building Fortress America. It's about raising security practices outside, which is why I believe in the virtual border concept. And I believe in tracking containers at where they start, not where they come. Private sector is going to change a whole lot more than the public sector. Private sector has a hard time with security as a collective good. They consider it a sunk cost. They hate it. You want to see a good example of private sector security? It's called security at airports before 9/11. The U.S. government as a whole is going to change more than the Defense Department. These guys have to aggregate a lot of disparate skill sets. All I'm talking about in this bifurcation is returning to what we know throughout our history. Interagency is going to change a whole lot more than jointness. Interagency is the new jointness. Peacekeeping is going to change a whole lot more than warfighting, which is still about smoking holes. And military operations are going to change a whole lot more than what we buy or how we buy it. Now, we send the defense budget over to the Hill. We call it a transformation budget. And the military expenditure force structure weenies come out of their little cubby holes in the think tanks around Washington. And they say, I'm a transformation expert. And I say, how do we know you're a transformation expert? They say, I've memorized every line of the U.S. defense budget. That makes me a transformation expert. So they say, I've gone through your defense budget. I've looked at every line. I don't see transformation anywhere. Show me where it is. We say, maybe you need a larger perspective. Because maybe there's all sorts of change going on throughout the system. But you're not paying attention to it because you only define it in terms of programs of record. The whack list. And that has to end if we're going to understand transformation, if we're going to understand the seam between war and peace, if we're going to succeed in reaching a finishing line in this global war on terrorism, which I'll define as making globalization truly global, connecting the disconnected, ending the threat as we know it.